The owners of insulae included many famous Romans, among them the orator Marcus Tullius Cicero. One of his insulae collapsed because it was so poorly made, but Cicero expressed no concern for the lives lost in the disaster, instead cheerfully noting that he would rebuild it and be able to charge higher rents for the new building. So much for food and shelter. What did Romans do to earn a living? Employment for 80 to 90% of people in the Roman world simply meant being a farmer out in the countryside. The remaining population, who were not in the army, mostly lived in cities. And for them, there was a variety of ways that they earned a living. The upper-class Romans, who wrote all the surviving sources, had very definite ideas about work and employment. They believed that most types of employment were morally degrading, and that truly civilized people should not work at all. Nearly everything that we would consider a form of work, earning a salary, buying or selling goods, manufacturing goods, all of these were considered vulgar, and an aristocrat could not dirty himself with them. Thus, to the upper-class Romans, only those people who were so rich that they did not have to do anything to earn a living were considered fully human and civilized. The things that aristocrats did that we would consider jobs, like serving as lawyers in a law case or being elected to a magistracy such as praetor or consul, were not considered real jobs because you received no pay. Politics and the law were truly the preserve of rich men, since they entailed spending a lot of money, but you did not get any in return. In keeping with the Republican ideology of virtue exemplified by Cincinnatus, the only profession that did not degrade someone was farming. Rich men were expected to gain and maintain their wealth primarily by owning land. Now, of course, by the Middle Republic, aristocrats did not do any actual farming themselves, and in fact spent almost all their time in Rome rather than on their country villas. They lived off the labor of hundreds or thousands of slaves who did the actual farming on their estates. This was the Romans' ideology. But in reality, the picture is more complex. Many rich Romans acquired their fortunes through means other than farming. Some were moneylenders who charged up to 60% annual interest on a loan. Some were, in essence, factory owners who had shops that produced goods such as lamps, bricks for building, or plates and containers made out of clay. While the upper classes could afford to be choosy about employment, the vast majority of people in cities had to work. The working classes can be divided into two basic groups: those whose profession required some sort of training, talent, skill, or capital, and those who were unskilled and sold their labor for wages. One of the ironies of Rome is that many poor citizens fell into the second category, the unskilled wage laborer. The skilled workers were often slaves and ex-slaves. In inscriptions on tombstones, about 2/3 of those who identify themselves as some sort of skilled worker are freedmen. Over 200 different jobs are mentioned on tombstones from the city of Rome. Many of these are specialty jobs, manufacturing luxury items, such as the plumarii, who apparently made a living exclusively doing embroidery using feathers, or the fabri ocularii, whose full-time employment was to manufacture the eyes for statues. There were 6 or 7 different types of makers of footwear, including those who made only boots, those who made only women's shoes, and those who wove sandals. Another large category were people who provided specialized services to the rich. One man's full-time job was simply to memorize the names of his patron's clients. And perhaps among the most unappealing service specialties was the alipilus, whose task was to pluck out underarm hair. Although aristocrats regarded work and money-making with scorn, many freedmen seem to have taken great pride in their work. This can be seen most clearly on their tombstones, which often boasted a sculptural relief showing the deceased engaging in whatever profession he or she had practiced. Even if they didn't have a picture, tombstones would often depict symbols which indicated the job he had held. For example, a butcher would have a selection of knives and cleavers on his tombstone. Sometimes, though, freedmen would get quite creative with their funeral monuments. One man, named Urasakis, who ran a shop that baked bread, had his tomb constructed in the shape of a giant bread oven, onto the sides of which were carved scenes of the baker overseeing his workers, grinding grain, kneading dough, and cooking it. His ashes and those of his family members were slotted into the openings in this oven-shaped tomb, just like the loaves of bread produced by his bakery. Another famous tomb belongs to a man who owned a construction company, and his monument features a prominent carving of a building crane used to erect structures. This attitude can also be seen in the decoration found in some business people's homes at Pompeii, such as one who had set into the floor of his house the phrase, "Profit is happiness." In addition to tombstones, another way we know about Roman jobs is because all the people who followed the same career would form professional associations. These trade associations were called collegia, and the members of a collegium would often put up monuments commemorating their accomplishments. The collegia also seemed to play a role in politics, and much of the graffiti on Roman walls consists of collegia urging other people to vote for a certain politician. Many Romans owned small shops where they sold goods. One interesting type of small business was the popinae, which was a kind of Roman combination of bar and fast food restaurant. These usually consisted of small rooms, often at the intersections of major streets. Across the front was a counter with 2 or 3 large clay pots set into it. Underneath the pots were places where small fires could be built to keep the pots warm. Probably these pots contained an assortment of gruel, fish stew, and garum, and passers-by who felt hungry could purchase a ladleful of whatever snack they wanted. The lowest form of employment was the unskilled workers, who had nothing to offer except their labor. They would hire themselves out in exchange for a salary to perform various menial jobs. Such wage labor was considered the most degrading sort because the Romans thought that this was the equivalent of becoming someone's slave. These wage laborers were called mercenarii, which is obviously the root for our word mercenary. Today, wage labor is usually calculated on an hourly basis, but in ancient Rome, the standard unit of labor for a mercenarius was 1 day's work. A day's worth of work was known as an opera, and contracts would specify a certain number of days' labor that the mercenarius was selling to his employer. The most common type of day labor job was simply to carry things around. A sizable percentage of the free inhabitants of Rome would have found employment in 2 fields in particular: the supply of food and other commodities to Rome, and the construction industry. A single construction project of the Emperor Claudius employed 30,000 men for 11 years just as diggers. The overwhelming majority of foodstuffs grown and goods produced in the Roman world were consumed or utilized very close to their site of production, Most items were sold by the growers or manufacturers themselves in their own neighborhoods or villages. The local marketplace was the center of most trade and transactions, and whatever goods were regionally available formed the entirety of most people's economic world. While small regional markets did a lively trade in local commodities, true long-distance trade was a daunting proposition. Transporting anything in large quantities overland was both expensive and hazardous. Bulky cargo could be transported more easily by water. However, seafaring technology was rudimentary, there was no effective way to predict storms at sea, and piracy was rampant. Despite these hazards, one of the most lucrative businesses in which one could make fantastic profits was the long-distance trade of luxury goods transported by ship. A single shipload of spices, fabrics, or dyes from the East could make one a millionaire overnight. The only people wealthy enough to have the capital necessary to outfit and equip such a ship and to be able to survive the loss if it did not return were the very rich. Now, this sort of activity was dangerously close in the Romans' eyes to engaging in vulgar commerce, and the Senate became concerned that too many aristocrats were debasing themselves by owning merchant ships. This led to the passage of a law which made it illegal for a senator or the son of a senator to own a large merchant ship. To get around this, aristocrats took advantage of the patron-client system. For example, an aristocrat might free one of his slaves and then provide him with the capital to outfit his ship. Therefore, the freedman would technically be the owner, but the profits would be funneled back to the patron. Through measures such as this, Roman aristocrats maintained an ideology in which they were all idle and did not dirty their hands with commerce, while at the same time they were getting rich off of commercial activity. Thus, even when it came to the basic necessities of food, shelter, and employment, the Romans' attitudes towards these fundamental aspects of life were inextricably wrapped up with notions of rank and status. For a Roman, what you ate, how you ate it, where you lived, and what you did for a living all carried moral overtones and helped to define your place in society. Now that we have a better understanding of daily life in ancient Rome, let's return to the historical narrative and see how the Republic began to unravel.